guys, this is Ryan from Bow Hill Games and welcome back to part 2 of our tutorial system in how to create RPG movement in GameSalad. Now this is grid-based RPG movement similar to that which you would have seen in Pokemon or the Zelda Game Boy games. And where we last left off, we had completed our move up function, our set of rules which moves the player up 128 on the grid. So this is going to be the same for our left, right and down behavior. So we could copy this and we will do later on. But first we're going to show you how this works. So we're going to go and create our move up button. So if I navigate back to my actors screen and scroll down to our move up button. Now if you're following along with the tutorial, then you'll have this template already. If not, then it'll be your own move up button. And we're going to go ahead and create a rule. Now in this case it's going to be if the actor touch is pressed, we're going to want to move up, okay? But all of our move up behavior is actually contained within our player. So this is actually all this button does is set our game attribute up to true. But we only want that to happen if the player isn't already in motion. Now remember back in tutorial 1 when we talked about the is in motion. And we're going to make sure the player isn't in motion to move up. So if I go down to in motion, so that's attribute game in motion is equal to false. So when our button is pressed and the player is not already in motion, then we're going to change our attribute game up to true. In this case it's a 1. But that's not enough. For grid-based movement, we don't want the player to be able to move in multiple directions at the same time. That's a typical thing that I always seem to forget when I'm doing these sort of games. So we're going to copy this rule 3 times, and change all of these to 0. So in this case it's false. And these are the other directions. So it's game down, game left, and game right. So these are actually really important because if you didn't have these rules, the player could, if for instance the up and left buttons were clicked at the same time, the player could essentially move outside of the grid that we want, and so we need to add these rules to stop that from happening. So this rule here is only for touchscreen. We're also going to add the movement for keyboard. So unfortunately, because it's an AND rule, we want the keyboard, we're just going to copy this entire set. Okay. And we're going to call this keyboard. And again, all it is actor key. In this case, it's up. So we're doing if touch is up and if key is up. So that's it for our movement. Now if we go ahead and preview this, it should be able to move. The one thing we need to do first is set our player speed attribute. Remember, all of our movement is based on this speed. Currently it's set to 0. So I'm going to change mine to 200, which should be quite a nice speed for our player to move. So I'll go ahead now and push the preview. And I've got mine set to iPad, so you should be able to see this quite nicely. I'm just going to click the up button. As you can see, my player was able to move off the screen. Obviously I can't move down, left or right yet because we haven't created those behaviours. But you can see we have the basic movement set up. So now we've got that, let's go and head back into our player and let's duplicate our movement. So we have up, down, left and right movement. Okay. I'm going to quickly name our group to move up because I never named it in the first place. Face up, it's not just movement. And I'm going to copy this rule and paste it. And now we can change this to another direction. So let's do down. So game down. So when game down is true, again we're flipping the graphics to false because of our left and right image. And if you've created a left facing animation, then there's no need for the flip rule. I'm going to change my image to front because I want the player to face at me when I'm moving down. And we have to make sure our collision is correct. So in this case, our collision now is, you guessed it, it's collision down we're checking for. So if collision down is equal to 0, so if it's not colliding with anything, then we're going to be setting our X motion to 0 because we don't want to be moving horizontal. We're going to change our animation to the downward facing animation, the frontward facing. And we're going to change our position. Now it's very similar, it's again player speed, but in this time it is -1 to 8 because we're moving down. Okay, and that should be it for our down movement. So let's call this one face down. And again, I'm going to rename it to down here. Okay, so we are now moving down. I'm going to move these into our movement group because I like to keep things a little bit tidy. And we have our movement down. Let's go over to our down button. First, let's copy the rules out of our up button. And paste them into our down button. So again, touch is pressed and game motion is 0, exactly the same thing. But in this time it is game up that gets changed to 0 and game down that gets changed to 1. So we're going to change game down to true. Same for our keyboard controls. Again, it's keyboard, now it's down. And game up is 0 and game down is 1. So I'm just going to preview that to see if it's working fine. So I should be able to move down and I should be able to move up. And you can see from my grid, if I let go of my controls, that when I let go in mid grid, it's completing the animation to my next grid cell. So we have grid based movement up and down. So it is now very easy to adapt our behaviours for our left and right controls. So if I navigate back to our scene, navigate back to my actors, and I'm looking at the moment in our down arrow. So let's copy these behaviours. So let's finish our arrows and then we'll finish our behaviour in our player. So I've copied the behaviours and I'm going to go to my right button, pasted those in, and in this case I'm checking all of these, and my down now needs to be 0 and my right needs to be 1. Again, for the keyboard, I'm changing key, which is now right, and I'm changing down to 0 and right to 1. So that's it for my right button, and I'll go down to my left button. Again, pasting the behaviours, changing down to 0 and left to 1. And for the keyboard, changing the key that is pressed to left, changing down to 0 and left to 1. Okay, and that is it for my left button. So now all that's needed is to finish our movement for grid is our character. So we haven't done the collisions yet, we've only been focusing on the movement. So if I go into my player, and let's copy the face down rule, and we're going to do face left first. Let's do face right first. Okay. So in this case, when game right, is equal to 1. Flip is false because I have an animation for facing right. Just need to find side 1. There it is. Let's call this move right. We're changing our collision from down, so we're not checking down, we're going to be checking the right collision. So when collision right is 0, then we're going to change no longer x, velocity x is now y. So when we're moving horizontally, we don't want our player to be moving vertically. So it's down to player, motion, linear velocity, and y. Okay. I'm going to change the animation to my moving right animation. So now I have my right animation in place. And I'm going to now change my movement to right. So I'm changing this to 0. And movement here is right. So it's 1, 2, 8 again for moving right in our grid. So just because I like to make sure things are working as I go along, up, down, right. So if I hold down right, it's moving. Hold down down, it's moving. If I hold down up, it's moving. Perfect. And I can't do 2 at the same time, which is what we want. Now let's go and finish our left movement. Okay, so we're going to copy again and paste. And I'm going to call this one face left. Our game attribute we're changing to left. Let's move this up so everyone can see. So when left equals 1. In this case, we are changing our graphics. So we are going to flip horizontally. So this time it's true. Side is okay. Our graphics are fine because it's actually going to flip that graphic. So we're looking the right way. And if I scroll down, we can look at our collision behavior. So we need to rename this to move left. And we need to make sure we're looking at the right collision rule. So if collision left, so it's game, and it's player collision left. So if 0, then we can move. So our linear velocity is fine. If I scroll down, we don't need to worry about our graphics because that is actually flipping. So it's going to be the opposite direction. I continue to scroll down. Our move to behavior needs to change. So that needs to be -128. And that's it. So if I go ahead and preview this, play, can my player move in all directions? He can. So we have our controls, and as you can see, if I let go, it completes in the grid cell that it's meant to be in. Instantly, I'll include a link to a brilliant grid page that I found in the description below for people to use. I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but I'll include that in the description because it's a really good resource when you're looking for things like this. Okay, now that's done, let's focus on the collision objects. So if I navigate back to my actors, you can see I already have some collisions in my actor screen. Now these objects are slightly smaller than the actual grid cell, and the reason for this is, say I have a wall in this cell here. Say this cell here is empty, so the player should be able to move there, but this cell here has a wall, and the wall is the entire size of the cell. If the collision is also the entire size of the cell, then they are in fact touching, in which case it would read that as you are colliding. So I'm creating my collision objects slightly smaller than the actual grid itself. In this case, let's start with the right collision, and I'll show you the size that I have chosen. I've chosen 60 by 60. Now you can actually make this any size you like as long as it is actually smaller than your grid cell. But I've just chosen 60 size by 60. So looking at the time for this video it's getting slightly longer than I would have hoped. I'm going to complete this behavior and I'll add the spawn to our player so you can see how that works. And then obviously you could continue to do this by yourself. It's just duplication of the same rules and logic, but I'll make a video to take you through the completion anyway. So the first thing we need to do is to constrain the position of our collision object to the next grid cell along from our player actor. So to do this, we're going to use the constrain behavior, and we're going to constrain the collision right position x to the player, so that's our game player x position, plus 128. Now this is because we're moving on the x-axis, because we're moving right or left, and we want it to be one grid cell along from our player. Now that's because I'm using a grid that's 128 by 128, so this value might be different depending on your player size. For our y position, we just need to constrain it to position y to the player position y. Again, we save this in a game attribute. And that's because we're not moving on the y-axis for this behavior. Now I like to group all of mine together, so I'm going to create a group, and I'm going to call this constrain position. Okay, so we have our logic for this in place. Remember, this actor is actually going to be spawned by our player, so that's fine for us for our purposes. But we need to tell our collision something to collide with. So we need some behavior in order to say, am I hitting this object or this object of this type? If I am, then set game collision right to true, or in our case is to 1. So I'm going to create a rule, and I'm going to say if actor receives an event and there's an overlaps or collides with option here, I'm going to say actor of type, and I have an actor just called ball. It is just a blank actor. It's just a purple square. So for instance, you might want to have if actor overlaps or collides with building, or an actor of tag with building. So if actor overlaps with wall, then change attribute game player collision right to 1. So I am colliding. Else game collision right to false. So anything that your player can collide with that you don't want your player to move through, that needs to be in this rule here. So it might be worth using tags, and remember you can have multiple here, so you can have all condition or any of the following. So but all I have in my scene is a wall at the moment, so that is our collide rule. So I'm colliding with a wall. That's spelt wrong. I'm going to quickly change that, I think. So my spelling is awful. So I've got my option there to collide with a wall. Let me open that just so you can see it for those of you who are following along. Now, you may have remembered right at the beginning, I created a attribute called show helpers, I believe it was called. And that is my personal preference, because obviously in game you don't want to see this square all the time against your player, but you might want to create a secret way of showing these. So for your testers, for instance, you're going to be testing your game, they might want to see these objects to make sure they are in fact being seen. So I'm going to create another rule, and again you don't have to do this if you don't want, and it's going to be when attribute game show helpers is 1, then I'm going to display text, and my display text is actually going to be my actor's name. So I'll drag this up so you can see it. just because I want to know what collision object that is. I'm also going to want my actor to be visible, so I'm going to change attribute, collision right, scroll down to graphics, and you'll have visible to true. Okay. So when it's not equal, I'm going to want that to be false. So I'm going to copy that behavior and paste that in and just move it into my otherwise section. Okay, so when game attribute show helpers is 1, then show my collision actor, otherwise don't show it. And that's really it for the collision. And now let's go and spawn this in our player. So in our player, right at the beginning, I'm going to create a new group, and we're going to place this here, and I'm going to call this group spawn collisions. And if I scroll down in our behaviors list, we should have an actor called, behavior called spawn actor. And I'm going to change our actor to our collision right actor, which we've been working with. Now you could spawn this in the correct position, but I don't need to because we're constraining our collision right actor to our player plus 128. So it should be fine. To see this, however, I am going to change our show helper attribute. Remember, that's what sets our collision to visible or not. And I'm going to select that to set that to 1, which is true. So our show helpers is active. We should be able to see our collision. And let's select preview. Okay, so we have a collision right object, and you can see it's in the cell next to our player. If I move around the screen, you can see it stays with our player at all times. So that's working. I'm going to end the video here, guys. Hopefully you'll join me in part 3, where we'll finish up our collisions for up, down and left, and we'll add in some of the wall elements so you can see this all working as it should. Okay, thanks guys. Hope to see you in the next video.